Once again, welcome. Thank you for joining us for this program in our Discover History series. I firstly would like to thank our Discover History series sponsors, the Camden River House Hotel and Inn and the Smiling Cow. So tonight we're going to be hearing from museum curator Laureen LaBar about a new book that she's written. It is called Maine Quilts, 250 Years of Comfort and Community. And I'm just really delighted that Lori agreed to do this program. A little bit about Lori: she's a former archaeologist, and she is the curator of, okay, goodness gracious, here's my thing. She's the chief curator of history and decorative arts at the Maine State Museum. So a wonderful, impressive title for a wonderful and impressive lady. I am going to stop my babbling and I'm going to turn the program over to Lori. Once again, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Julia. That was so sweet. So kind of you. Yes, it has been a wild day in this great state of Maine. And I'm awfully glad to be with you there for a few minutes there. It looked like I might not be, but we got computer difficulties under control. And here I am. So yes, I'm very happy to have Maine Quilts, 250 Years of Comfort and Community be finally published, because of course we had a COVID moment there. So I'm going to share my screen and we'll get started. Okay, from beginning. Come on, honey. There we go. Whoops, it went too far. So here it is. There's the book. And there's a couple of essays. Thank heaven for Lynn Bassett and Pam Weeks, who are my colleagues. Lynn Bassett is she's a freelancer and she's one of the most knowledgeable people I know. And Pam Weeks is also very knowledgeable, and she is at the New England Quilt Museum. So they did a couple of essays for the book, as did Deb Grana, who is a collector in New York State and has been finding some wonderful Maine quilts that she's been sharing with the Maine State Museum. So before I get started, I just also have people to thank, which is the Maine State Museum, of course, and the Kobe Foundation, the Viles Foundation, and Pine Tree Quilters, plus some really amazing volunteers. So thank you so much, everybody. So the organization of the book, I wanted to show how books can inform what we know about the past. And by so doing, I wanted to bring women back into the discussion, because history often leaves women out entirely, because so much of what history is about is whatever men have written, and women often are left kind of on the periphery. And in my early drafts, I also wanted to, I called the overall part of it, I called it quilt speak, because trying to tease out what the quilts were telling us and what they had to say about the past as well. And so the book's roughly in chronological order. And when I can, I talk about the people behind the quilts. And I also talk about what was happening in Maine at the time and how history and politics are reflected in the quilts and how the quilts can inform what we understand about the past. So one of the questions I get asked a lot, of course, is what's the oldest quilt in your collection? What's the oldest quilt in the book? So here at the bottom, you see 2012.45.1. If there's just a straight number, that means that's from the Maine State Museum. Otherwise, I talk about where there's a little code for what museums it is, or it still says straight out what museum it is. So this is the oldest quilt. This is the oldest quilt in the museum's collection. It's one of the oldest quilts in the book, and the fabric of this quilt is fun. And yes, that is, you're not imagining things. This is upside down. There's a building upside down. That's my first clue that this is upside down, but a label is right side up. And this is how the family saw this quilt. So we're used to us being like you and me, we're used to us being the spectators of the quilt, being the viewers of the quilt. But when the quilt was made, the audience of that quilt was actually the people lying in bed. So there's a couple of quilts that look upside down in this book and this presentation, and it's because to the people sitting in bed or lying in bed, everything would have been right side up. So that's what's going on here. And the fabric for this was done, most of it was done in the mid 1700s to the sort of third quarter of the 1700s. And this might have been around 1790 actually. And this two different types of printing on the quilt as well. The darker the darker is block printed, so each color has its own block. And then there's also something called penciling, which really is painting, but you know, terminology is funny. And where if you're going to have, sometimes it was just cheaper to pay people to, usually women, to just put another color over it. So if you're going to have, you might print with yellow and then add blue to make the green leaves, for example, or vice versa. And this print then is copper plate engraved. So if you think about a broadside, most of us have seen, you know, the broadside of the Boston Massacre, that Paul Revere's outfit, how they printed that, and they printed it by engraving on copper and then putting dye on the copper and pressing it into paper. And we're used to seeing that. We've seen that all over the place, engravings, you know, all kinds of them that we have seen in the past. But this is the same type of a thing, only they're using dyes. And around 1756, somebody figured out how to do that. So anyway, so this is about the earliest one, but was probably around 1800 that this quilt was made. So the first part of the book is called Tradition and Colonial Ties. And it's one of the things I wanted to point out here is how Maine quilts really reflect the culture that the people in Maine came from. So that in 1790, 93% of the 93% of the Euro-American settlers, the non-Native American settlers, and people who lived in Maine rather, over 90% were from Britain. And if you add Ireland into the mix there, so from all those islands, it goes up to 98% of the Euro-Americans were from the islands that now comprise, that are now home to Great Britain and Ireland. So the quilts that you see in Maine at the time, there's not very many of them because it was kind of a rough and ready place, and there weren't that many people, for starters, that were, you know, Euro-American. And so there aren't a lot, and it's been a long time. A lot of the quilts haven't made it. But there's a couple things here. The upper right is what's called a medallion quilt. And so there's a square, that center square is called a medallion, and that has a date of 1804 on it. And it has a Maine history. And then the larger of well, it's actually small on the corner here, the red one. This is what it looks like if you just trace the quilting of it. So these were called whole cloth quilts, and they're not really whole cloth. There's 1, 2, 3, and a bit on either side widths of the cloth. And then it's been what they call calendared, which is pressed and given a glossy sheen. But what was really outstanding about these quilts was the quilting. And this is something that sort of was very, very popular here, and then died out in the mid 1800s, whereas in some parts of Great Britain, it carried on for a bit longer. But they're very, very British, these quilts. And of course, in the late 1700s, early 1800s, it was a time of revolution. We can all think of one revolution. The American Revolution was happening in the late 1700s, 1770s, to 1790s. But there was another revolution going on at the same time, and that was the Industrial Revolution. And within the Industrial Revolution, there was another revolution, which was that of textile dyeing. There was a lot going on. So this quilt that you've just seen has these two different kinds I've told you about. And so the block printing was lovely. You could get many colors, but it was expensive to print many colors and very time consuming to print many colors. Now, the copper plate engraving was gorgeous. It had lots of shading and everything, but it was also time consuming. You can see that here's a block. You can sort of see very easily what kind of how big of a piece of copper was being used there by the repeat. And you could only get one color. So some bright light sort of thought, what if we could take that copper plate and turn it into a cylinder so it would just keep running? And then we could have a couple of them that were linked, and we could print different dyes on the same fabric, and it could just keep rolling. And some bright light figured out how to do it. It was called cylinder printing, and it was definitely the way of the future. So this quilt, which is from the Saco area, from the Libby family, it also has two different techniques on it. This is a block print from around 1750. And these two are two different cylinder prints. And the block print was said to be from a wedding dress from Hannah Libby, and which is wonderful, except for one thing. There were 7 Hannah Libbys that all lived around the same time period, and it could have been probably any one of 4 of them. So I'm just going to hope that, I just have to say that's a family story, and maybe it's right. It probably is right. So this fabric was made on the continent. This may have been made, not sure where this was made, but one of the things I love about the 1830s is the absolute wonderful clash of colors. There's this stereotype that fabrics were everything was so brown and kind of dingy, and nothing could be further from the truth when you take a look at some of these gorgeous, wild colors. I think of the 1830s as being kind of having the same aesthetic as like 1968 to 74. I mean, we're talking wild, just about psychedelic. So here's a quilt that actually has all 3 of the techniques we've been talking about. And this is from the Wilson Museum in Castine. And here's my copper print. This is a cylinder print. This is a block print. So we will have an exhibit when the museum reopens. For those who don't know, I'm happy to talk about it later, but the museum is closed for the moment to get a new heating system. And when we reopen in a couple years, the opening exhibit will be the quilt exhibit. And the Wilson Museum has agreed to lend this, and I hope it's still available when the time comes, because I don't know any other Maine quilts that have all 3 in them, and it's wonderful. So I've been talking about Euro-Americans, and that's mostly what I'm going to talk about. But Wabanaki, who were here, of course, before the Euro-Americans showed up, the Wabanaki seized on European textiles and needles and beads, and they made the most amazing applique I have ever seen. I have not seen anything like it. With maybe a few exceptions of what's going on today, maybe. So these are 3 examples. This one is Passamaquoddy, and this is a picture of Denny Sakabasin, who was the daughter of the Passamaquoddy chief at the time. And this is her, believe it or not, this is her baby. This is folk art, remember, things are not to scale. We used to think it was a doll, but the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer of the Passamaquoddy has told me that it is actually her baby, because she had a young child that would have been in a cradle board at that time. And so they put their babies in cradle boards, kind of like swaddling clothes. And that's what these 2 pieces are. These are sort of dressy versions thereof, but that's what they are. They're cradle board wrappers, which are kind of like swaddling clothes. This piece in the center, where is my mouse going? Let me see if I can get it to cooperate better by putting it on the cover of my book. Yes, now I can see it, and it's gone. Oh, hang on. It's possessed. Okay, back that. Sorry about that. So these were probably on the side of leggings like that. And they were made mid-century, in the early, just before the turn of the century, probably the 1800s. And this is a picture from 1890. This is Francis Stanislaus, and he's probably the 3rd generation to be wearing very, very similar applique work. So this is silk ribbon applique, we call it, because they're using little silk ribbons, and then they're cutting them even finer. So these lines, these light lines that you see here, these big ones, that's about 1/4 of an inch at the base of those triangles. And a lot of the lines that you see are actually, boy, I want to say they're about 1/16 of an inch wide. They're very, very fine, and they're silk, just astonishing work. So these are pieces that were attached to coats, and then as the generations changed, or as someone's form filled out as he became older, you could put it on a newer outfit. Oh, it's done it again. What is going on with this presentation? I'm so sorry. My mouse is very excitable tonight. The 3rd piece that I'm showing you is exceptional. It was done probably in the late 1700s, maybe 1790s. And it's also silk ribbon applique. This is silk work. It's embellished with beads, as are the leggings. These are not embellished with beads, probably because babies shouldn't have beads around them, maybe, I don't know. But they don't have beads, but the other two do. And this was almost certainly made by a woman named Molly Molasses. And it is unheard of to know who made a piece this old. That information just doesn't get carried down the generations. And for this one, we not only know who made it, we also have a picture of Molly wearing the hat much later in life. And so Molly Molasses was born, she lived until, she was born in the late 1700s, and she lived until 1865. Let's see if I can get this to move. Yes, I can. So back to the revolution. One of the things, of course, that happens when you have a textile revolution and you have a more efficient way to not only produce fabric as you were getting in the Industrial Revolution, but also to print fabric, and this whole wonderful, this new evolution in print technology, is that fabric becomes cheaper. And as a result, women start using a lot more of it, a lot more variety. And you get a whole new wave of wonderful new patterns that come in. So these are actually all from the 1830s. And again, a big range of color and for the most part, they're new fabrics. The piece on the lower right does have some recycled dress fabric in it, but the rest were nice, shiny new, especially this one, just because it's in such great shape, you can really tell, shiny new. And then the upper left is actually a wool quilt. And it's kind of an interesting thing. This is a real Maine thing, these quilts that are made from wool, and they're patchwork around this time. And it's possible that this was a reaction to, it started as a reaction to the scarcity of cottons during the War of 1812. And I talk about that in the book. And then it carries on until the late 1830s or so before it goes away. And the quilt that we saw just a little bit ago that had the wedding fabric from the 1750s and then the really bright 1830s fabric, this dates to about the same time period, and it's from the same family. So I joke that this was the everyday quilt, and that the other quilt was the Sunday go to meeting quilt, because this got a lot more wear. If you can imagine this quilt, it's faded from light, as you can see on this edge. There's a lot of fading. So keep in mind that even this has faded a little. This is the closest to the original color. These browns would have been almost black originally. So we're talking black and orange and turquoise and green. So a lot of really bright fabrics there. Around 1840, there's a new fad that comes in, which is making album quilts. And we call them friendship quilts today a lot of the time. Or sometimes I've heard them called sampler quilts as well, but I'm going to call them album quilts because that's what they were called at the time. And the center for this is the Mid-Atlantic, Maryland, Baltimore. You may have heard of Baltimore quilts, and they are absolutely exceptional quilts. The ones from Baltimore, just gorgeous. But one of the reasons they're so gorgeous is that there were professional women who were making these patterns, and they were selling them, and people were then making them, completing them at home, these blocks. And so there's a real continuity of motif and format and fabric and a real look to them. Well, nothing could be further from the case in Maine. Maine, it is strictly amateur hour. It is a totally amateur affair, album quilts in Maine. Groups are gathering just like they are in the Mid-Atlantic. Churches are gathering, different groups who are, they're teetotalers and who are trying to get the state to go dry, prohibition groups, that kind of thing, temperance, as it was called. There are lots of different groups like that are gathering together and making these album quilts. And these two examples are from the same community, and they're 15 years apart. And I think you can kind of see that they just look like everybody did whatever they wanted, and then they just threw them together. And sometimes you get something in a sort of a planned layout like this that has a medallion in the center. But oftentimes you just don't. You just get this, which is absolutely wonderful and lovely. So these are the same, it's the same community. It is, let's see, what's my next slide? It's the same community, 15 years apart. And this is one of the reasons that they are so much fun, is the artwork that is in them. So this is an applique piece, and this is George Lovett's fishing vessel, and you can see the fish that he's caught or about to catch, I hope. And I think one of them actually has a line that kind of is attached to it, although that's the rudder line, so maybe not. Anyway, one of the fun things about this is that this is inscribed. Notice I'm not saying signed. This is a stamp, like you would use for clothes or whatever you wanted to label. And it says George Lovett. Now, I will bet my bottom dollar that George, who was a fisherman, probably did not do this very skilled applique. However, his wife has signed another block, and she may have made it. It's so signed versus inscribed. Those are two things that we excuse me, I've got something that's blocking here. There we go. Those are two different ways that people put names on quilts. So if it's signed, it means it's done, we presume, by the person that made the block. If it's inscribed, sometimes you're just kind of operating on faith with that. But for example, if all of the handwriting is the same, you can assume that they're inscribed. If every block is signed differently with a different hand, then we sort of assume that they are signed to a certain extent. And that, even if George didn't make it, the fact that his name, and in this case his boat, is on the quilt means that he was central to the life of whoever was the recipient of this quilt. So even though we don't think that George made the block, we do know that in this social circle, he was a very important member. Another thing that's kind of fun is doing some sleuthing. And this is one that Deb Grana did a lot of the work on. She found the quilt and then she donated it to the Maine State Museum. Yay, Deb. So this is a quilt that has no dates on it. However, so this being a book talk, I'm going to read from the book, because this is where the detective work comes in. So we've got the folk art, and now we need also some detective work. So Angela Emery married Richard Lee Jr. on March 3rd, 1854. Her married name appears on her quilt block. Valera Jane Smart married John Murch on August 28th, 1859. Her maiden name is on her quilt block. Together, these wedding dates imply that the quilt was made between the spring of 1854 and the fall of 1859. Quilts take time to make, however, and some blocks are finished earlier than others. Clues on another block might move the completion date later. That block is decorated with an image of the Portland Breakwater Lighthouse, which is what you see right here. The half-mile-long breakwater was completed in 1837. Officials constructed a wooden lighthouse at the end of 1855. Now that's within our wedding dates range. Back to the book. William Lee Willard of Cape Elizabeth was the second keeper of the lighthouse. He served from June 1857 until his death in February 1860 of a tumor. He was 26 years old. His older brother, Benjamin F. Willard Jr., took over the care of the lighthouse until a new keeper could be found. In 1861, Benjamin and his wife, Hannah Ann Stanley Emery Willard, had a baby whom they named after Benjamin's deceased brother. And I don't know if you can see it here, but but inked on the front door of this is the lighthouse, by the way. It's a very good rendering. On the front door are the initials WLW for William Lee Willard. And so that's either for the brother or for the son. So we don't know, but what this might have been made as late as 1860 or 1861. And there's some fun connections with the Civil War. There was a Confederate attack on a limited one, just some people trying to steal a ship, blowing up a ship in Portland Harbor, and this group was actually involved with that as well. So there's a lot of fun history around this. And for those of you who know Portland, this is the wooden structure was replaced by what's now known as Bud Light. And now here we go. Here's another one. Quilt research saves the day. So here's a quilt. Before I get to the saving the day, this is a quilt. People say, what makes a Maine quilt a Maine quilt? So I've talked about the wool quilts, but that's a really limited time period, and it's not, you know, that's limited. So it's hard to say what makes a Maine quilt, but there are some factors that lead you to think that perhaps this is a Maine quilt. And this one has several of those factors. For starters, it has what we call cut corners. See those corners that are cut out there? They're not really cut out. They were never there, but they're planned that way. And they're planned that way because then when you put the quilt on the bed, you don't have a bunch around the bedposts that falls around the bedpost. So it's super to use for a bed that has bedposts. And this is something that was done in Maine, done all over New England, but in Maine, it lingers. We have cut corners in Maine on quilts that date to 1895 to 1900. It's something that it is kind of unusual, and I don't know if it's because people were conservative and like to do the same style, or if people just were such Yankees that they weren't about to get rid of a perfectly good bed, and so they kept using these old-fashioned beds, or if it's a combination of things. But there it is. There's another thing here. These quilt blocks are, well, these days we call them potholder quilts, and they didn't call them that at the time. But you can probably see it here. There's two different colors of what we might think of sashing, but it's not sashing. Each one of these blocks was done separately and quilted separately and bound separately. So at one point there was a stack of squares that would have looked a lot like a stack of potholders. And then they were whip stitched together and it became a quilt. And of course, people being people, there's always somebody who doesn't get the memo about what size these are supposed to be. So when you see it's a little bit wonky, and you can see here and there, let's see if I can find it off the top of my head, but there's several places where the squares don't quite line up. And when you see it, it has a kind of, it's just sort of a little bit, it kind of rolls because nothing's really square, you know. And I'm sure any of you who are quilters, you're going to do a quilt with everybody, and everyone, you're saying, okay, it's going to be 11.5 inches. And somebody at the end will come up and say, oh, I thought that was 12 inches, or I thought it was 11 inches. There's always at least one person that does that. And the same is true with the potholder quilt, which may be why, as handy as it is, it didn't catch on as much elsewhere as it did here. And if any of you have ever read, there's a wonderful book called Big House, Little House, Back House, Barn, by someone whose name has just gone out of my head, but wonderful book. And it talks about the connected farm buildings of Maine and New England. And you can find connected farm buildings where the barn is connected to a little series of outbuildings and then the house. You can find them elsewhere in New England, but the sort of the epicenter of them is in Maine. And it's the same with some of these characteristics I'm talking about now in terms of the cut corners and the potholder quilts. They're elsewhere, but they're more common in Maine. And then there's something which is really fun, which is the fact that Mainers really like to frame their blocks. So let's take a look at this top row. So first one is just flying geese. Yep, that's fun. The next one though, here's the block, and then there's a frame for the block. And then here's a square and a square. And then there's a frame for the square and the square. And then there's a frame for the frame. Here's another one. There's a star, and then there's a frame, and then there's another frame. The same with this one. We have two more frames. This one only has one frame. About half of these have several frames. So here's this circle and then the corners, half square triangles in the corner, and then 1, 2, 3 frames around that. So that's another thing that happens a lot in Maine in the mid 1800s. So when you take a look at this piece, the fact that there's 3 strong trends that were fairly more common in Maine than elsewhere, I would say this is a Maine quilt, and it is. For a long time though, we thought it was from Bristol, from South Bristol in Maine, down on the coast, because nobody had been able to really find all the names. And there were a couple names. One of them was like, I can't remember it. It was Susan somebody. It might have been Clark, but it was a name that was relatively common. And there was another name that was, again, Sarah somebody, but another sort of commonish name, not outrageously common, not like Smith, but fairly common. And there were, someone found the graves, the donor found, actually this was a purchase. This was a gift from the Pine Tree Quilt Guild, by the way. Thank you very much, Pine Tree Quilt Guild. So, but someone was able to track down people who were graves of people, and they were both, one was in Round Pond and one was in South Bristol. So that's where it was attributed to, but I could not find anybody else. So you notice that it was, we acquired it in 1970. That's what these first two number, this first number means. That's when we acquired it. And technology has rather changed since then. So I was going through to see where I could find, who I could find. And this name was giving me trouble. As you can see, this is a pretty accurate picture of it. And those are the quilt stitches. So it's pretty small. And it was, somebody had down that it was Trifonia Handlet. I could not find Trifonia Handlet to save my neck. But I went back to it not long before. Actually, I went back to it in between the printing that got canceled because of COVID and the new printing, just to make sure I had everything, everything was up to date. And Ancestry had updated as well. And so I typed in Trifonia Handlet, and it said, "Do you mean Tryphosa Hoodlet?" My gosh, there she was. And she wasn't down in Bristol. She was in my hometown. She was in Dresden. And then I checked the other names, and I found every single one of them. Everyone was, except for one, was from Dresden, and the other one was from the next town north. So we finally have the right home for this, and the hometown for this. And we still don't completely know the story on it, but this 1845 quilt, we now know where it was from. And I was able to go to one of the cemeteries, and I found a bunch of the names, and I told them, we figured out the quilt, we brought it back. So that was very fun. So that brings us up to mid-century, and then that brings us up to the Civil War, which is of course 1861 to 1865. So a lot of the organizing around those album quilts, the groups that had been making them, this was their hour. All that organization that they had sort of established for the different causes or church groups, whatever they were working on, be it temperance or abolition or just the church group, it really found, they found new ways to act during the Civil War, and they were making things for soldiers, and they were trying to raise money for the cause as well. And of course, individuals were also making their own quilts. So the quilt on the left was made in J, and she did not have any children. Octavia Lewis did marry Octavia Lewis, but she went by Octavia. She did not have any children that were the right ages to be in the Civil War, and her husband was also too old. But she obviously felt very strongly about it, and she wrote a little poem. And this is her applique work. And look how much more coarse it is than the work that was being done by the Wabanaki artisans. I mean, this is lovely. It really is lovely, but it just boggles the mind. I have to go back to that Wabanaki work. Absolutely boggles the mind how fine it is. And so some individuals made their own quilts, of course, but groups made quilts as well. This one is another potholder quilt. And in this case, the organizers, who included Cornelia Dow, who was Neil Dow's daughter, and Carrie Davis, who was a neighbor, and she was probably the organizer for it. I gave her first billing because she did this block, which is of course the center block. But they must have handed out both the stars and the fabric that the stars are on, and then everybody else added their own touches to it. So the bindings are different fabrics and the backings are different fabrics, but the front fabric and the ground fabric and the stars are consistent. Some of these look a little lighter, but that's because they have a conservation fabric put over them because they were starting to fall apart. And another thing you can see is there's some shadows around some of these. They look a little dirty, but what it is actually, it's not dirt, it's inscriptions. Every single one of these is inscribed. And one of the fun things about this is that dates to June of 1864. It's from Portland. It was made in June. And when we've been looking up trying to look up all the inscriptions, one of them was actually first published in May of 1864. So these women are really bringing up to date. It's a group of educated women. They are all either students or, in the case of the two organizers, alumni, or there's a preceptress and the assistant preceptress, a woman and her sister who ran a girls' school in Portland called the Home Institute. So these were educated women, and they were reading up-to-date material. And there are, of course, a lot of Longfellow quotes in here because the Longfellow's family home was in the same neighborhood as Davis and Dow both lived in. So after the Civil War, there are a lot of changes. So I'm actually calling this part of the book and this part of the upcoming exhibit I'm calling it Cottons Galore, because there's a couple things that happened after the Civil War, one of which is that a lot more women have access to sewing machines, which is very nice. But again, there's another big push of fabric technology, and fabrics become even cheaper. And what's happening in Maine is that in Maine, of course, in Massachusetts, which is the big center for it, but also in Maine, these big cotton mills are coming in and really transforming Maine. And there's fabrics are much cheaper than they have been, relatively speaking, and women respond, and they respond with a lot of prints. So there's a couple fun ones. Remember I told you there are a couple from the late 1800s that still have cut corners? Well, here they are. And they're from central Maine, from the Dexter, Corinna area. And then this piece is these days we call pieces that have these little tiny squares, we call them postage stamps quilts. This one actually has little tiny half square triangles, and each square is about an inch across. I think it's exactly an inch across. So each triangle is the half of that. It's just insane what people were doing, and to some extent still do. But so that's a lovely postage stamp quilt. This one today we call these charm quilts, and every single fabric in this quilt is from a different bolt of cloth. So she must have had a lot of fabric. She also probably traded with a lot of friends, and she probably must have had some left over because there's hardly any blues in this, and to have enough that was enough to be able to shade each row. It's a really fabulous. Carrie Files made this piece, and actually Mrs. Cushman, whose name has just escaped me, first name has escaped me, but she made at least one more quilt. And some of you who are big quilt buffs will know that it's in the Triplet Sisters in their collection. And we were finally able to identify who their maker was. So that was really fun. I opened their book and went, what's our quilt doing in there? And it was very, very similar. The only difference is that in their quilt, the green's on the inside and the pink's on the outside. So that's just way fun. So you get a lot, and take a look too at just the care the precision that's involved in making these quilts. I mean, there's a lot of calculated precision going on here. And the same is true with all these quilts, which are also from the last quarter of the 1800s. And one of the fun things about this pattern, for example, which is called log cabin overall, and then each of these have variations or called something else, but it has a lot of straight lines, so it makes it, if you are so inclined, it makes it much easier to sew with a sewing machine. But also that means that the making quilts kind of changes as well to a very solitary affair when you're using a sewing machine, because you can't very well lug your sewing machine when it's a treadle machine from all hither and yon. There's glimpses that you get in these days of the names of quilt blocks. So you get names of quilt blocks that are like Delectable Mountains, which was part of, oh dear, it's just gone out of my mind. The Pilgrim's Progress by Bunyan. And that was one of the steps on his path. Much better than the Slough of Despond, which was another one of them. One fun thing with this quilt, it's actually that block right there. We have 2 of these. And this was a donation from or transfer from the Rocky Mountain Quilt Museum, because they realized it was from Maine. You know, it should just come home to Maine. And that it's a fundraiser quilt. So the earlier fundraiser quilts, they made a quilt, they raffled it off or sold it, whatever, high bidder usually. But after this was from 1898. And at this point, they're sort of realizing that you can actually make money from these twice. So they would make a design, and it's often a fan design or something that has petals or something that has segments to a quilt. And it's often done in just muslin, plain muslin. And you can pay money, people would pay money to sign their name, in this case, sign their name. In the twin that we have to it, they actually just wrote their names down, and somebody, it's all one person's hand. Somebody has inscribed it all and embroidered it. But this is actually done with ink, and people signed it themselves. And this particular signature is in Chinese. So it was really a fun exercise trying to translate that and trying to see what could we tell about this community. And I don't know if we still know the man's name, because it might have been his name, or it might have been the name of his business. But anyway, that's a fun thing. So again, here we go. Lots of precision, lots of measuring. And then to every reaction, there's an equal and opposite reaction. So I think that might be part of the reason that crazy quilts became so popular, or were popular at the same time, is in a reaction to the precision of what we've just seen. I don't know that that's true. I can't prove it, but it's a hunch. So these are all crazy quilts. And one of the things about crazy quilts is, I mean, if ever there was a motto, it would be nothing exceeds like excess. So this is a classic crazy quilt. It's made out of silks and velvets, mostly silks. Sorry, excuse me, I have a drink of water. And every single surface is embellished. Some of them are painted, most of them are embroidered. Every seam is embroidered and covered with embroidery. There's some of these are painted, there's sequins, there's braid. It is absolutely as busy as you possibly could get. 1884 and this one is from Round Pond down in Bristol area. This one is wool. It's a little bit smaller, and it's a little bit later. It's the early 20th century. Well, about that time. And there are a lot of Maine crazy quilts that are wool, which is unusual, but it's not terribly surprising given the fact that Maine is a cold place and there's a lot of wool fabrics and a lot of fabric scraps from making wool clothing. And we suspect this person lived in a very rural, right in the middle of the woods. And we suspect that she was in Lewiston at one point, and we think that she may have worked in one of the factories making clothing, but we haven't found her yet. So we're still working on that. Either that or she had a family member or a good friend who did. And then this one's from around 1910, 1912. And this is from up north in Maine. It's from Presque Isle. And I keep telling people where things are because there's a lot of people here tonight who aren't from Maine and may not know our geography terribly well. So forgive me for those of you who are like, yes, I know where Presque Isle is. Thank you. Yes, so it's up in Aroostook County. And this one for this quilt, I got an apology for this quilt because they approached the Maine Historical Society down in Portland, and the curator loved it so much he didn't tell me about it until after he had it. And he said, I know, Lori, I know it should have gone to the Maine State Museum, but I just couldn't help myself. I'm sorry. So that was very funny. But it is absolutely electric. It is so gorgeous. The colors, and the back is all black velvet. And all those bright flowers are actually velvety. They're velvety, and they are from like the flowers from making hats. These are all scraps from a milliner, from a hat maker. And the back of it is satin, and it's the satin of that bright yellow. Right there. It's absolutely electric. It's one of the most beautiful quilts I've ever seen. And I'm not sure I'll ever take his apology, really. I mean, seriously? No, I'm kidding. Yeah, thankfully they're letting us borrow it. Thank you, Maine Historical Society. I do appreciate it. And with that, now I've kind of hinted our way that we're getting into the 20th century. Continuity and community and change. There's some continuity too, actually, but community and change. So there's a lot of changes that happen in the 20th century. Holy smokes, are there ever? But there's a lot of that also continues. There's a lot of community that gets reflected in quilts. But one of the things I want you to see here, so these are from the 1830s. This is a little earlier. This is all made of poultry ribbons. So there's more community reflection, a different kind of community reflection in this. All of the poultry ribbons range from around 1903 to 19, I think the latest one is 1911. So a little after that. This one's from the 1990s. But I do want to go back. Take a look at the colors, especially of these two quilts. And then look at the tones here. We're looking at a very different palette. This is not strictly, it's not completely 100%, but in general, I think there's a lot more pastels, and there's a good reason for that. And that reason's actually political. Because one of the things that happens in the early 20th century is World War I. And if you can remember World War I, the teens, there was this absolutely wonderful fashion for white. Oh my gosh, those wonderful white dresses. Think about them. Well, one of the reasons there's a fashion for white dresses is that dyes are not available because Germany's making the dyes and we're at war with Germany. So all of a sudden our dyes weren't available. And of course, at the end of World War I, not only was the German economy in shambles, but all of the industry was just demolished. So American chemists take up the charge, and they develop completely different colors. In a way, one reason for that is that they were looking for colors that would look good under these newfangled electric lights, which were going to be a thing of the future, and they were right. So we get different colors at this time, and that's one of the reasons for it. May not be the only reason, but that stuff that does play into it. This is a yo-yo quilt, for those of you who know yo-yo quilts. There's also new ways to communicate patterns. So this 11 of the patterns, and she's repeated patterns a few times here too, but 11 of them, including this one, including that one. These were designed by a woman named Evelyn Fillard and they were published in the newspaper, in the Kansas City Star. So then they were published in other newspapers as well. And so this woman lived in Dexter. She lived in Dexter, Maine, which is really Piscataquis County. It's a little town, and it's in a pretty rural place. But she found the newspaper, and then more than half of the patterns are patterns that she may have made. And she may have made this with her mother, who was the woman who made those wonderful little, remember I said about the quilts that were from the like 1890 to 1900, and they still had the cut corners. Those were made by this woman's mother. And she was living with her daughter at the time. And the precision of the stitching on this is absolutely astonishing. Very, very good artisan. So album quilts that come back to them again. And these are two examples. And the left one is from Fitzberg, and we call it the Fitzberg Song Quilt because every block is a song. So the Fitzberg Welfare Society was the organization that made this. It was a group of local women, and they raised money to get stuff for the fire department and for the library and that sort of thing. And then in the 1930s, they noticed that kids were going to school without shoes. And in Maine, that is serious business, to go to school without shoes. So they switched from fundraising for organizations to fundraising for individuals. And this was one of the ways that they raised money for things like that. So each block is a song. And then the quilt was hung in a local store. And it was hung with a key that was shuffled. So it was not in the right order, but that definitely gave the locals some time to sort of think about it. So maybe it would stay in the community. excuse me, was made in 1935, and in 1936 it was auctioned off. But it was not really auctioned, it was sold. And you had to, in order to, you bought a ticket and you guessed what the songs were. You filled it all out. And then the person who got the most songs right won the quilt. And it was indeed a local person who won it, but she had been living in Boston. She had moved to Boston to seek her fame and fortune. And then in the end, she sent it back home as she got older. She sent it back home. And it was kind of fun taking a look at these. Some of these, we all can guess what some of these are. You know, here is a bear going over a mountain. Anyone care to guess what that one is? Yes, I think I can guess what that is. This is a city scene and people walking on the sidewalks of New York. The Three Crows. Here is the owl and the pussycat who have gone to sea in a pea green boat. I didn't know that was a song. I had to look. It was really fun looking these up as I was going, but some of them I don't know. And oh my goodness, some of them, there's a couple I still didn't get. So I think I have them all but two identified. One of the fun things was, so this was made in 1930s, but the songs were all popular in the 19 teens. So that tells you something about the age of the people who are in this group. And who has the free time, of course, is the older ladies whose children are grown. And they're the ones that have enough time to be able to be active in a group like this and take the time to do this, to sew the blocks. So that's not terribly surprising. I think we can probably all identify with that. And then on the right is a quilt that was made for the bicentennial. And I love this quilt. It's mid 70s, obviously 76. However, they're using some newfangled technology. I don't know if any of you are quilters or if any of you are crafters or if any of you are old enough to remember. Shockingly, I am. But there was a product that came out about then in the early 70s, mid 70s, that was it was a ballpoint paint. So it was a tube of fabric paint with a ballpoint, and you could use it, you could write with it, you could use it like a pen. And that's exactly what they have done here. So instead of embroidering the titles for the different squares, they have used these ballpoint paints. And I love the fact, so this is a real classic bicentennial quilt. There's the national flag and the state flag, and it's the Spirit of 76 national flag. Here's here's the bicentennial flag and the state seal, the national state seal. Here's our pine cone and tassel. It's and there's the church, and there's Fort Westerns on here somewhere. Here's the fire department. But so all the important landmarks, they're making tribute to the most important landmarks in their community. And my very, very favorite is this one. It's Mr. Market. So they've got the grocery store on there, which I just think is absolutely wonderful. There's a great big space in between these two, and that's there to remind me because after there's a big gap of time between these two quilts, and there's a big gap of time where there aren't very many quilts made in Maine. The ones that are utility quilts for the most part. We don't see a lot from the 40s on. And after World War II, I think possibly because during the Depression, it became, there were a lot of quilts that were made that were utility quilts that were made with whatever you could get your hands on. And then of course, in the early 40s, you start getting all these feed sacks and stuff. And I don't know if there was a stigma against it, or whatever the reason, after World War II, it became this sort of seems kind of stodgy and old fashioned. And it wasn't until the 70s that it became really popular again, even though a lot of what they were doing was sort of the past of the imagination. I don't care. It's still wonderful. It's still quilts. So it became a revival, which has never slowed down. And there are a lot of quilts being made today. And this is where it's my turn to apologize, because I cannot possibly do it justice. The quilt scene in Maine is phenomenal. There are some incredibly talented people out there. And I only had one little chapter to talk about it. And here I have, here are 4 people, you know, I mean, that is just, there's no way that this is representative. So be aware that there is just a whole world of modern quilts out there that are just phenomenal. But one of the things I did find with this is that there are kind of 3 threads now of types of quilts. And I think those threads were common 100 years ago as well. So one is traditional quilts, people who just want, people who just want a quilt. They want something warm, they want something comfortable, and they want something that looks like something their grandmother would have recognized. And they just want it on the bed, traditional. And then there are people which I call neo-traditionalists. And those are people like Wendy Reed. Some of you know Wendy. A lot of you know of Wendy. She is, this is another potholder. She loves the technique because she can make the quilt blocks right on her lap and she can carry them anywhere. And this is a very traditional technique. Some of these are traditional patterns that she's found elsewhere. Some are of her own imagination. Here's something which often just has the 4 petals and she's made it into a windy flower. And so she's a neo-traditionalist. And this is as well. Frass and Slade, these guys have been around. They've been quilting together. It's a couple, and they've been quilting together for over 40 years. They have been involved in some of the most important early quilt exhibits that nationwide, and they're still at it, and they're still doing some wonderful work. So this is actually a whole cloth quilt. So remember our tomato red example from slides and slides and slides ago, where it was just solid red, and what was the character was the quilting, which you couldn't really see from a distance. You had to just appreciate it close up. Well, this is the same type of a thing. It's a solid piece of cloth. In this case, it is in fact a whole cloth. And then they have painted on it with dyes, and they've painted the sky the night of January, I think it's 23rd, 2017. So they had her father and a family friend, both died 4 or 5 years apart on the same day. And so this is a view looking up, and it's to honor these people whom they loved with the North Star and all of the movement implied by the quilting, and then the outline of the different oh dear, word's gone. Anyway, of the constellations. There we go. Sarah Ann Smith's quilts are also, some of them are quite sort of neo-traditionalist, in that this is a good example of that, in that she's using applique in such a way that it's a very modern application of applique, as it were. And this is talks about how we are all descended from the stars. We are stardust, as it were. And then Jude Spaxx is, she's an artist who works out of Belfast, and she does fabric collage. And her business name is Cloth Eye. And each one of these eyes, which is probably only about 2 inches across, is about 4 feet wide. Each one of those eyes might have 24 pieces of fabric in it. It's absolutely astonishing, the depth that she gets and the expression that she gets with that. So she would fall, both of these guys, actually all 3 of them, fall under more of what you'd call art quilts. They are sort of new technologies. In the case of Frass and Slade, they've developed some of those technologies and new techniques. And this is art for art's sake. It's not meant to be on a bed. All 4 of these are wall pieces, in fact. But all three of these they're not meant to be bed quilts at all. So if you think about it, though, 100 years ago, we also had those kinds of trends. They look more old-fashioned to us now, but at the time, they were really breaking new ground. And there's a community focus for the contemporary quilts as well. This is the newest quilt in the book and in the exhibit. When it finally, I think it'll be the newest one. You never know what comes along, but at the moment, this is the newest one in the collection. This was finished in November or December, I can't remember which, of 2019. And I'll start over. So a woman I know who is a quilter got sick, and as part of her recovery, she decided to make, she had a tremor as a result of her illness. And so as part of her recovery, her therapy was to make one of these blocks every day. A lot of people were doing it that year. And it's about a 5-inch piece of fabric with a circle on it, and she sewed each one by hand. And then what sets her quilt apart from others. So this is the overall quilt, and this is before, I think you can tell that's before it was sewn. This is just when it was a quilt top. And here is 2 pieces of the back. So here's this corner, and then it's flipped over, and you're seeing the back here. So what she did after she sewed on each circle is she cut out around the back to sort of save on, make it less bulky. And in that 1/4-inch seam allowance, she wrote down what she did that day. So this quilt becomes a diary, and it becomes a year in her life and a year in the life of her community. And there's a lot of community information on there. I think in about 50 years' time, this is going to be one of the most important quilts in the country, just because of the glimpse it gives us of everyday life. So let's say some of it's very, very mundane. Some of these green ones, or maybe this one, she couldn't think of anything, so she just put something that was bright green and said, Pat mowed the lawn today. You know, it just was a day that was really quiet. Other days, and this was the National AIDS Day. Here, she was reading a book that talked about the stars in the sky. I think it was in the title somehow. Here, a friend of hers came over, a friend named Mary, and that was the highlight of her day, and she was trying to think of, what do I put down? What do I put down? And then she remembered that she had this Christmas fabric that had the Virgin Mary on it. So here we go. So there's Mary on it. And then it talks on the back. It says Mary came and all of that. So that's this wonderful quilt. And that brings us up to the present. Julia, do I have time for just a smidge more?
Yes, you do. Yes, and we have a ton of questions all in the queue already. So yeah, go ahead.
Okay, I'll just do it real quick. I just have a couple slides. I have to take another quick drink of water.
Sure.
So this is one of those quilts I was mentioning about an art quilt. This is an art quilt, even though it was made to fit a bed, it's an art quilt. And I was asked by a friend who has a bookstore, because it was, you know, it's a time of COVID. Ordinarily, I would be there. I would be signing the books, all that kind of thing. And so he decided that he would just do an interview with me. And so one of the questions he asked me was, what's the funniest thing that's happened to you doing this research? And I'm like, oh gosh, well, I've had lots of fun, but has anything been funny? So I made something up, and I said, I'm just going to make something up. So this was made by Anne Drain Cotter, this quilt, in 1868 in Alexander, Maine, which is way over by Calais. And the fabric, in fact, she bought the fabric in St. Stephen, which is over the line in New Brunswick, because that's where she could buy fabric. And there's think of this quilt. Remember, when you see this quilt, that all these leaves would have been bright green. There's a couple leaves here and there that are made out of what was probably old curtains that have kept their color. But all of these tan things used to be bright green. So originally it was bright green, bright red, bright pink, yellow, very, very boingy, pretty psychedelic. And so my story was, because I loved these reminded me of Peter Max illustrations. So my story was that Peter Max was just really burnt out because the fame and the crazy life of the 1960s was getting to him. So in 1968, he figured out how to time travel back 100 years. And somehow he wound up in Alexander, Maine, where he befriended Anne Cotter, and the two of them got together and worked on a quilt. And he just loved these sons so much that after a little while, he realized that, frankly, it might be crazy in New York City in 1968, but in Alexander, Maine, it was really quiet. So he decided to go back to the present. And then, of course, he started making these pictures with these wonderful suns and these wild things. And he went on to be an internationally known psychedelic artist. But really, we have Anne Drain Cotter to thank for that. So that was my fun story for that. But of course, that's not what happened, but it was fun to talk about anyway. And I thought you'd love the quilt. So I wanted to show you the quilt. So that's what I have. So I'm ready for questions, Julia.
Okay. All right. Well, my goodness, that was excellent, Lori. Thank you.
very silly at the end.
No, it was a very cool way to wrap that up. I'm going to ask my question first because I can, and I encourage everybody else, go ahead and type your question. We've got like 19 in the Q&A box already, so we may not be able to get to all of them. I apologize.
I think a couple of them are friends saying hi.
They are,
I didn't get the message in time to be able to reply to them, so hi.
Okay, so my question is about crazy quilts.
Yes.
And I want, and again, since you're the chief curator of history and decorative arts,
that's in lieu of pay. They can't pay me so they just give me a really good title.
Was there anything else in decor happening at that same time period that sort of reflects that craziness? I mean, was the wallpaper, a crazy, were people's clothing? Can you just talk about that real quickly?
Clothing, not so much, but I mean, it was the time when, if you think about one of those Victorian houses that is just chock full of stuff, and then it has these plants growing all over the place as well. So there's not any place to rest your eye. It's just full, chock-a-block full. That's kind of the setting for these. It definitely is of its time.
Okay, so interesting to know that it kind of carried over into some other of the decor. Okay.
And it's, it also, people are talking about how it was influenced by some art movements because of there's like a lot of Japanese motifs in them and bugs and that kind of thing. But I could talk about it for a long time, but it's not as interesting for some people, so I'll shut up. It's in the book. It's in the book.
Okay. So Dana wants to know, I'm interested in knowing when cotton fabric started to be produced here in America and how long it took to replace English fabric in American quilts.
Well, I know that they were making, somebody else in the audience is going to be able to tell me, Joanna, what the date is for America, but I believe it wasn't until around 1800, because it was about 1791 that we started making it in Rhode Island, and it took a little while to kind of get its feet out from under it. And it wasn't until 1820 that there was a mill in Maine that was making what they called gray goods, which was just basically plain white cotton. Mm-hmm. And then it took another, I think, 4 years before there was a printing mill as well. So it was slower to take off here in Maine, but southern New England, I'm pretty sure it was the 1790s, and then it took a little while before we had enough volume and before there were enough mills, because of course the British were very careful not to let weavers emigrate, because they wanted to control the industry. And so it took some pretty good espionage, basically, to get some of the technology here, and it finally succeeded, but it took a while.
Kathy wants to know, is the Cape Elizabeth album quilt from 1846 a potholder quilt?
I can't remember. Hang on. That's embarrassing. I can't remember Oh, and look, I opened up right to it. Yes, it is.
Okay.
Good eyes, Kathy.
All right.
Is that Kathy Gray?
Yes, it is.
Yes, it is. I knew it.
So Dana, by the way, was clarifying, you had mentioned a book a little bit earlier, Big House, Little House, Back House Barn. And
Thomas Hubka.
Thomas Hubka is the author. So I just wanted to make sure that got mentioned.
Thank you, Dana.
Anne wanted to know where, were all the fans signed or inscribed in Chinese, or just the one that you pointed to?
Just the one.
Okay.
Just that one I pointed to. Everything else was English. And this was it could have been his name, but it sounded more like it was a name of his business. But in the register, the Maine register for that year, it looks like it's his name. They're acting as if this is the person's name, but in fact, pretty sure that was the name of the laundry business.
Working in a library, I truly appreciate all the detective work that went into your research into these quilts.
Thank you.
It's very interesting to hear about it.
It was really fun.
So someone wants you to talk a little bit more about where they'd be able to view some of these quilts. You had mentioned when the museum opens again. So maybe you want to talk a little bit real quickly about the book and the upcoming exhibit.
Yes. So the book and the exhibit were supposed to happen at the same time, but you know what's happened. So first COVID happened and we put it off for a year. And then so the book was going to came out in March and the exhibit was going to open in April. And then that didn't happen either because again, because of COVID. Actually by the time it happened, the second postponement was because our HVAC system died. Just croaked, and unfortunately it croaked in a mechanical room that needed asbestos abatement, and so there was nobody who could do the work because there was nobody who could do both asbestos abatement safely, So the good news is we're going to have a new heating system, and the museum has never been a problem because we had drop ceilings and all that, but we have to move all of our objects out so that they can put in the new heating system. And while they're doing that, they're taking out the asbestos that was above the drop ceiling. And so we hope to open again in 2025.
Wow. Oh, we have to be patient.
Yeah. If we're lucky, it'll be late 2024, but I'm not betting the rent money.
Okay.
Not with all the supply problems that everyone's having right now.
It's complicated for sure.
It's complicated.
So someone else wants to know, are there shaker quilts in your collection?
There are not shaker quilts in our collection. I do not know of any really good shaker quilts from Maine. I don't know of any.
Sherry wants to know if you could please elaborate on what are poultry ribbons?
Oh, okay. If you go to, that's a really good question. Sorry about that. If you enter your chicken at the fair and it wins a prize, that's a poultry ribbon. You get a ribbon, and it's and there was a poultry association. It may still exist. I'm afraid I didn't look at that. I was only looking. It was very sort of blinders on. Must get this book done. I didn't even look to see if it's still going. It probably is. And so these women were really involved with it. So I don't know if they won a prize for every. Sorry, this is going to be a little bit dizzy making as I try and find the 20th century. Yeah. So I sort of doubt that she won every single one of those prizes. But it could have been with her mother and her grandmother also being involved, and friends and stuff, that she may have accumulated them that way.
Okay. I like that it's from a prize-winning chicken. That does make me very happy.
All prize-winning chickens, probably chickens plural, because this is over several years.
So Carol wants to know, have you found any documentation of Canadian, or have you found any Canadian influences in your Maine quilts?
I really haven't. Apart from, Andraine Cotter she bought the fabric there, but I have not. In part, I think it's because a lot of the Canadian, there was a lot going back and forth, and it wasn't so much that the Canadian community was separate from ours until very recently, except in the county. And in the county, it was also very, very tight and very close. But like the Acadian tradition up in the St. John Valley, they did not make quilts for the most part. They wove bed blankets.
That's very interesting.
Kind of yeah. But and then in lower down, it was all, everybody was related. So it wasn't like there was a separate tradition of, like I said, the people where there could have been with the French, the Acadians had moved north long before and had moved south long before, and they didn't have a tradition of quilting.
Okay. Carol also wanted to know, did you document mostly historical society or museum quilts, and how many were from the general public?
That's a good question. The ones in this display are I've mostly used our own quilts and then augmented where I can, but I used, it is mostly in collections, but probably a quarter of them are in private hands, maybe.
Okay.
Maybe not even a quarter, maybe only a fifth.
Laura has a fun elaboration on something you mentioned. We called the ballpoint paint pens liquid embroidery.
Sure. Yeah.
That's very cool. Linda wants to know, what did you mean by the term utility quilt?
I mean, it's one that you use until it's dead. And that's mostly what they are. So if it goes on your bed and it gets used every day and it finally just wears out, you know, that's a utility quilt, as opposed to the ones I sort of slyly refer to as the Sunday to go to meeting quilts, which you only bring out every now and then. Like if I have some quilts that I only bring out when company are coming, and then they go away so they don't get worn out. But the quilts that are on the bed every day, and a lot of those are also not, especially the ones that are 20th century. The 20th century, especially the ones that I'm thinking of, and where I was talking about utility quilts, was during the Depression. A lot of, and the 40s, a lot of those were really basic. They were just plain squares. They weren't very fancy. A lot of them were, I mean, this is the same time period, but this is more of a Sunday go to meeting quilt.
Sure.
Because of all the little pieces, and it's also in very good condition. So it was hardly used.
Okay, so I love Linda's next question here. Did any of your research reveal that quilts were used to, quote, stow valuables inside the quilt backing? This is a common theme for some of the historical novels that I read, and I kind of want to know, is this truth or fiction?
Fiction.
Oh.
We have found nothing. We have found nothing interesting.
No secret treasures.
We found the coolest treasures we found inside quilts have been other quilts. We have one quilt that, frankly, when I saw it, I'm like, I would not let a dog sleep on that quilt. It was so ratty and in such crappy shape and filthy. Oh my gosh. And then we started to, but I brought it in. If you have one of those, I'm not bringing it in, by the way. I'm not taking it. The only reason I brought this in is this was an interesting family where each generation was very small, and there had only been one person who had everything and then brought it down. And then, so it was all the quilts from one family, with one exception. We still haven't found that one, but it was all the quilts from one family. So I wanted to have them all, good, bad, and ugly. And this one was ugly. But when we started taking a look at it, it turned out that it was a whole cloth quilt that was the finest fabric I've ever seen in a whole cloth quilt. It was a jacquard fabric. It was a fabric where there was a complex pattern in the wool. I mean, it was unbelievably gorgeous fabric. And then it kind of got ratty, or it became out of fashion or something, and somebody put something over it. And then somebody put something over that. And then in the late 1800s, somebody put something else on it, and then later on cut it off. So there were just and they tied it on. So there were just little tiny dots of red fabric from the turn of the 20th century. And and there were pieces that had been cut off, and somebody had saved them. But it was just a phenomenal quilt originally. And it was a really good documentation of how that family's fortunes had changed over the years as well. To have something so high end, and to have a quilt that the servants had wound up using. And then with time, sort of their fortunes kind of declined a little bit.
Speaking of fortunes, Carol says that she says, I have found pennies in old quilts. Do you know anything? Do you know anything about that? Why pennies would be sewn into?
I've never seen a penny in a quilt.
Huh. That's very curious.
I know why pennies were put in the hems of curtains, and that was just so that it would keep the curtain.
As a weight, right? Or
as a weight.
Okay, that makes sense. Well, a lot of these other comments are huge thank yous, just lots of accolades, such a wonderful book. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us. Again, Lori and I were talking about this ahead of the program. What you want to do is you want to go to your local bookstore and please let them know that you are interested in getting this book, Maine Quilts, 250 Years of Comfort and Community. And we are all very much looking forward to the reopening of the museum. So that
me too. Let me stop screen sharing, because we've all seen that now. So there we go. I can't wait. It'll be wonderful to have it reopen. And when it reopens, it will not be the same museum. Keep in mind, because if you think about it, it's 50 years old. Some of those, when you walk in, some of those exhibits have been there for 40 years. And if you have to redo your bathroom and it hasn't been done, or your kitchen and it hasn't been done in 40 years, you're not putting all those old fixtures back. You're going to do something, you're going to update it. So we're doing the same thing. So even though we're closed, I tell you what, we are busy. We are really busy trying to get it together to open. Well,
Maine State Museum always does such a tremendous job. So I'm confident in whatever you decide. I am very much looking forward to checking it out in a few years.
Thank you very much.
Laura, I want to thank you again for joining us tonight for this talk, and I want to thank all of you who showed up for this this program in our Discover History series. We have a ton of history programs happening during the month of October, as well as other fun programs, nature programs, programs from the Camden Conference. You can find out about all of them by going to librarycamden.org/events, and you are all welcome to attend any of our programs. They're free, they're fun. Join us. We do them almost every Tuesday and Thursday night. I'm recording this, so if you enjoyed it, please share the recording with your friends and family. You can find it on the Camden Public Library Program's YouTube channel. All right, Lori, have a great evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
I hope we can collaborate again in the future. This was a lot of fun.
That'd be great fun.
All right, good night.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everybody.